The letter arrived 3 days after my father died. I stood in the entrance hall of my small apartment, holding the cream-colored envelope. Real paper, thick and expensive. My name and address were written in flowing black ink. No return address. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the same elegant handwriting. Dear Miss Olivia Thompson, it is with mixed feelings that I write to inform you that your presence is required at Thornhill Mansion in Parktown, Johannesburg, regarding the reading of your father's will. As his only living blood relative, you have inherited certain responsibilities that must be addressed in person. A car will collect you on Friday at 10 a.m. Yours sincerely, Harold Winters, family attorney. I read it 3 times, my heart pounding. My father, James Thompson, had walked out when I was 5 years old. My mother raised me alone in our small home in Cape Town, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She never spoke of him, and when she died last year, I assumed any connection to him had died too. I didn't even know he was still alive until I got the call about his death. Heart attack, they said. And now this letter. Thornhill Mansion. The name meant nothing to me. Friday came quickly. At exactly 10 a.m., a black car with tinted windows pulled up outside my apartment building. The driver, an older man with gray hair and a stiff manner, opened the door for me. Miss Thompson, he said with a small nod. I'm Davis. I'll be taking you to Thornhill. The drive to the airport was quiet. Davis didn't speak, and I had too many questions to know where to start. On the plane to Johannesburg, I stared out the window, wondering what waited for me at Thornhill Mansion. Another car met us in Johannesburg. As we drove through the city and into the wealthy suburb of Parktown, the houses grew larger and the trees older. Finally, we turned onto a long driveway lined with jacaranda trees. At the end stood Thornhill Mansion. It was like something from another time. 3 stories of sandstone and dark wood, with a wide veranda wrapping around the front. Tall windows reflected the afternoon sun. The garden spread out on all sides, neat and perfect. We're here, miss, Davis said, stopping at the front entrance. Mr. Winters is waiting for you inside. I stepped out of the car, my small suitcase in hand. The mansion loomed over me, making me feel small and out of place in my simple dress and worn shoes. Before I could knock, the heavy wooden door swung open. A tall, thin man with silver hair stood in the doorway. He wore a dark suit that looked expensive but old-fashioned. Miss Thompson? Welcome to Thornhill. I am Harold Winters. His voice was as formal as his appearance. Please, come in. I followed him into the entrance hall. It was bigger than my entire apartment, with a sweeping staircase and marble floor. Paintings of stern-looking people hung on the walls. They all seemed to be watching me. You must be tired after your journey, Harold Winters said. I'll show you to your room. We can discuss the matter of your inheritance after you've rested. As we climbed the staircase, I found my voice. Mr. Winters, I don't understand any of this. My father left when I was 5. I didn't even know he was living here. Winters paused on the stairs, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't read. Your father's story is complicated. It will be easier to explain once you've settled in. My room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a long hallway. It was bigger than I expected, with a 4-poster bed and windows overlooking the gardens. Everything looked old, but well cared for. Dinner will be at 7 in the dining room, Winters said, moving to leave. Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper will come for you. Wait, I said. Is there anyone else in the house? Family, I mean. Winters hesitated. No living family resides here now. Just the staff, myself, Mrs. Bell, Davis who drove you, and a few others who maintain the grounds. He paused. But Thornhill has been the Thompson family home for 3 generations. Your grandfather built it, your father grew up here, and now it belongs to you. He left before I could ask any more questions. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of it all. My father had grown up in this mansion. He had been wealthy. Yet he had left us to struggle, my mother working herself to exhaustion while he lived in luxury. Why had he never made contact? And why, after his death, was I suddenly important enough to be summoned here? I unpacked my few clothes, feeling even more shabby as I hung them in the massive wardrobe. Then I went to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens below. A movement caught my eye, a figure walking between the hedges, a woman in a dark dress. She stopped, looking up at my window as if she knew I was watching. Then she disappeared behind a tall hedge. There was something strange about the way she moved. Something not quite right. A chill ran down my spine, though the room was warm. Suddenly, Thornhill Mansion felt like more than just an unfamiliar place. It felt like somewhere I shouldn't be. Mrs. Bell came for me at exactly 7 o'clock. She was a round woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her black dress and white apron reminded me of housekeepers in old movies. "Miss Thompson, it's time for dinner," she said with a small smile. "I hope your room is comfortable?" "Yes, thank you." I followed her down the hallway. "Mrs. Bell, how long have you worked here?" "Oh, nearly 30 years now. I came when your father was still a young man." Her voice softened. "He was a good boy, your father. Just had some troubles." I wanted to ask what troubles, but we had reached the dining room. It was long, with a table that could seat at least 20 people. Only one place was set, at the head of the table. "Am I eating alone?" I asked. "Mr. Winters had business in town. He'll speak with you in the morning." Mrs. Bell pulled out the chair for me. The meal was delicious but strange, served in courses by a silent young maid who kept her eyes down. I felt awkward eating alone in the big room with its dark wooden paneling and heavy curtains. A large painting hung above the fireplace, a family portrait. I recognized my father as a young man, standing behind an older couple. They must be my grandparents, I realized. People I had never known existed until today. After dinner, Mrs. Bell returned. "Mr. Winters thought you might like to see the library. There are family photographs that might interest you." The library was on the ground floor, a room lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling. A fire burned in the fireplace, casting warm light over leather chairs and reading lamps. On one wall hung framed photographs, the history of the Thompson family. I moved slowly along the wall, studying each picture. My grandfather, stern-faced in a business suit, standing in front of a mine. Another showed him shaking hands with government officials. There were wedding photos, holiday snapshots, images of parties with guests in fancy clothes. And then I found pictures of my father as a young man. In one, he stood proudly next to a sports car. In another, he was at a party, arm around a beautiful blonde woman. "That's your mother," Mrs. Bell said softly from behind me. I turned to her in surprise. "My mother?" "No, my mother had dark hair. She wasn't." I gestured at the glamorous woman in the photo. Mrs. Bell's face changed. "Oh, I see. I meant your father's first wife, Elizabeth." "First wife?" The room seemed to tilt. "My father was married before he met my mother?" Mrs. Bell looked uncomfortable. "I thought you knew. Elizabeth was his wife for 5 years. She died in an accident. It was after that when your father left Thornhill for a while. That must have been when he met your mother." My head was spinning. So my father left a life of wealth, married my mother who had nothing, then abandoned us and came back here? Why would he do that? "It's not my place to say, miss." Mrs. Bell's voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. Winters will explain everything tomorrow. For now, perhaps you should rest." Back in my room, sleep was impossible. I kept thinking about the photographs, the mansion, the wealth my father had kept secret from me. And beneath it all was a feeling that something wasn't right here. The way people spoke about my father, with caution, choosing their words carefully. What were they hiding? Around midnight, I gave up on sleep. I put on my robe and slippers and decided to explore the house. The hallway was dark, lit only by small wall lamps that gave just enough light to see where I was going. I walked quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of wood. Old houses always had their own noises, I told myself. Downstairs, I found my way back to the library. With just a small lamp turned on, the room looked different, full of shadows. I went back to the wall of photographs, wanting to look at them more closely. But something had changed. The picture of my father with the blonde woman, Elizabeth, was gone. I stared at the empty space on the wall, sure that I wasn't mistaken. The photo had been there earlier. Now there was just a lighter square on the wallpaper where it had hung. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned quickly, heart pounding. No one was there, but on a small table near the door, something caught my eye. A shadow that shouldn't be there. I moved closer. It was the missing photograph, lying face down on the table, as if someone had removed it from the wall and then dropped it. With shaking hands, I picked it up and turned it over. My father's young face looked back at me, smiling, his arm around Elizabeth. But now I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Elizabeth's face was scratched out, the photo paper damaged as if someone had taken a knife to it. I nearly dropped the picture. Who would do this? And why? Another creak, closer this time. I looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Bell or perhaps the maid. Instead, at the doorway stood a woman in a dark dress, the same woman I had seen in the garden. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows. She didn't speak, just watched me with an unnerving stillness. "Hello?" My voice came out as a whisper. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer. She took a step backward into the hallway, still watching me. "Wait," I said louder this time. I moved toward the door, the damaged photograph still in my hand. But when I reached the doorway, the hall was empty. She couldn't have moved that quickly. It wasn't possible. I looked both ways down the hallway, but there was no one there. A cold draft touched my face. One of the doors further down the hall was open, swinging slightly. The door to the garden. Without thinking, I followed, stepping outside into the cool night air. The garden was silver in the moonlight, the hedges casting deep shadows. I saw movement again, a dark shape moving between the trees. "Please," I called. "I just want to talk." But the figure disappeared into the darkness. I stood alone in the garden, suddenly aware of how foolish I was being, chasing shadows in a strange place in the middle of the night. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the ground near my feet. A torn piece of dark fabric, like it had caught on a branch and ripped. I picked it up. It was old, the material faded and worn. I went back to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep was even further away now. Who was the woman? Why had she damaged the photograph of my father's first wife? And what did any of this have to do with me? I placed the torn fabric and the damaged photograph on the bedside table, determined to ask Harold Winters about them in the morning. But when I woke up, both items were gone. Harold Winters was waiting for me in the breakfast room, a small, sunny place overlooking a different part of the garden than my bedroom did. He stood when I entered, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I hope you slept well, Miss Thompson." I hadn't, but I nodded anyway. "Mr. Winters, someone was in my room last night. They took something." His expression didn't change. "The house is quite secure, Miss Thompson. Perhaps you misplaced the items?" "I didn't misplace them." I described the photograph and the fabric and the woman I had seen in the garden and the library. "Who is she?" Winters sighed, putting down his coffee cup. "Thornhill is an old house, Miss Thompson. Sometimes shadows play tricks in the evening light. As for the photograph, I'm sure it's still in the library where it belongs." His dismissal made me angry. I know what I saw. And the photograph was damaged. Someone had scratched out Elizabeth's face. At the mention of Elizabeth's name, something changed in Winter's eyes. A flash of something. Concern? Fear? "I think it's time we discussed your father's will," he said, changing the subject. "After breakfast, please join me in the study." The study was a smaller room than the library, with a large desk and more family portraits on the walls. Winters took a seat behind the desk and opened a leather folder. "Your father's will is quite straightforward," he began. "As his only living child, you inherit Thornhill Mansion and the Thompson family fortune." I stared at him. "Fortune? What fortune?" "Your grandfather, Richard Thompson, made his money in gold mining. He was one of the most successful mine owners in South Africa. Your father inherited everything, and now it passes to you." Winters pushed a paper across the desk. "The estate is worth approximately 50 million rand. The number made me dizzy. 50 million. I had grown up counting pennies, watching my mother take on extra shifts to pay for my school books. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why did he leave us if he had all this? Why did he let my mother work herself to death when he had millions sitting in the bank?" Winters looked uncomfortable. "Your father's actions had reasons behind them, not all of which I'm at liberty to discuss." "I deserve to know the truth." "Yes, you do." Winters hesitated. "But there are conditions to your inheritance. Conditions your father was very specific about." "What conditions?" "You must live at Thornhill for 1 year before the fortune becomes fully yours. During that time, you cannot leave the property for more than 3 days at a time. If you fail to meet this condition, the entire estate will go to charity." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He expected me to put my life on hold for a year? To live in this museum to a family I never knew? Those are the terms, Winters said simply. You have 24 hours to decide whether to accept them. I left the study feeling trapped. Either I gave up the fortune that should have helped my mother and me all those years ago, or I became a prisoner in this strange house with its secrets and shadows. I needed air. I went outside, walking through the gardens, trying to think clearly. The day was warm, but the grounds had many shady spots under the old trees. In a far corner of the garden, I found a small cemetery, Thompson family graves, going back 3 generations. My grandfather and grandmother's impressive headstone, a smaller one for Elizabeth Thompson, my father's first wife, died at 25, the inscription said. So young. And then my father's grave, the earth still fresh, James Edward Thompson. The name meant nothing to me, a stranger who happened to share my blood. As I stood there, I noticed something at the edge of the cemetery, half hidden behind a large tree. Another headstone, older than the others, almost covered by weeds. I moved closer, pushing aside the overgrowth to read the name. Margaret Thompson. No dates, no loving inscription, just a name. You shouldn't be here. I jumped at the voice, turning to see Mrs. Bell standing a few feet away. Her usual friendly expression was gone. I'm just looking at the family graves, I said. Who is Margaret Thompson? Mrs. Bell seemed to struggle with herself before answering. She was your grandfather's sister. She lived here at Thornhill her whole life. Why is her grave separate and so neglected? Some family matters are best left alone, Miss Thompson. Mrs. Bell's voice was firm. Please, come back to the house. It will be lunchtime soon. I followed her, glancing back once at the forgotten grave of Margaret Thompson, another family secret, buried under weeds. The rest of the day passed slowly. I wandered through the house, looking at rooms that were perfectly maintained but felt unlived in, like a museum, not a home. In most rooms, sheets covered the furniture, and dust lay thick on surfaces. Only a few areas seemed to be in regular use: the kitchen, the dining room, the library, and what had been my father's bedroom suite. I avoided that room. I wasn't ready to see where he had slept, to touch his things. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the library, to the wall of family photographs. As Winters had implied, the photo of my father and Elizabeth was back in its place. But I wasn't imagining things. Her face was still scratched out, the damage obvious now that I knew to look for it. As evening approached, I made my decision. I would stay at Thornhill for the required year. Not for the money, though I couldn't deny it would change my life, but for answers. There were too many questions, too many strange things happening here. I found Winters in the study again and told him my decision. Very good, he said, showing no surprise. I'll prepare the necessary papers. He paused. There is one more thing your father wanted you to have immediately. He opened a drawer in the desk and took out a small key. This opens his personal safe in his bedroom. He left specific instructions that you were to open it yourself with no one else present. I took the key, cool and heavy in my palm. What's in it? I don't know. Your father valued his privacy. Winters stood. His bedroom is at the end of the east wing, 2nd floor. Safe is behind the painting of the mountain above his bed. I waited until after dinner to go to my father's room. The house was quiet, the staff having retired to their quarters in another part of the building. The east wing was the oldest part of the house, the corners darker, the air cooler. My father's bedroom door was made of heavy dark wood with an old-fashioned handled lock. The key Winters had given me opened it easily. Inside, the room was larger than mine, with tall windows and heavy curtains. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, the covers neatly made as if waiting for someone who would never return. A painting of a mountain hung above it, just as Winters had said. I moved the painting aside, revealing a small wall safe. My hand shook slightly as I inserted the key and turned it. The safe door swung open. Inside was a single envelope with my name on it. With a deep breath, I took it out and opened it. Inside was a letter, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. My father's writing. My dear Olivia, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have agreed to stay at Thornhill. I know you must have questions and anger about why I left you and your mother all those years ago. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do hope for understanding. I loved your mother deeply. Meeting her was like finding light after years of darkness. But my happiness came at a cost. The Thompson family has a shadow over it, a curse that began with my grandfather and continues to this day. Elizabeth wasn't my first wife, she was my second. My first wife was your mother. We married in secret because my family would never have approved. She was expecting you when the accidents began. First, a fire in our apartment in Cape Town. Then, your mother's car brakes failed. We survived both times, but I knew then what was happening. The same thing that had happened to others who threatened the Thompson legacy. I made a choice to protect you both. I staged my own death in a boating accident, then created a new identity. I made sure your mother received a small income, not enough to reveal the connection, but enough to help. At least that was my intention. If you grew up in need, then I failed in this as I did in so much else. I returned to Thornhill only after I was sure the danger had passed. I married Elizabeth to maintain appearances. She learned too much. After her death, I lived alone here, a prisoner of this house and its secrets. Now Thornhill is yours, along with its curse. Be careful who you trust. The danger is still here within these walls. Look for Margaret's diary. It will tell you everything. With love and regret, your father. James Searce read the letter twice, my heart pounding. A curse? Accidents? And my mother had been his wife, not a woman he abandoned? None of it made sense. And yet, it explained the feeling I'd had since arriving, that Thornhill was hiding something dark. Margaret's diary. The same Margaret whose grave lay neglected in the corner of the family cemetery? I needed to find it. But as I folded the letter to put it back in its envelope, I noticed something else in the safe. A small photograph tucked into the back corner. It showed my father, much younger, with his arm around a woman I recognized immediately. My mother, smiling, looking happier than I ever remembered seeing her. They stood on a beach, the sun setting behind them. I held the photo carefully, this proof that there had once been love between them. Whatever had happened later, whatever mysteries Thornhill held, they had loved each other once. A noise in the hallway startled me. Footsteps, passing by the door, then stopping. I quickly put everything back in the safe, closed it, and replaced the painting. The footsteps moved on, fading away. Back in my own room, I locked the door and put a chair against it for good measure. I placed my father's letter and the photograph under my pillow. Tomorrow I would start looking for Margaret's diary, and I would find out what curse haunted the Thompson family. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old house made me jump. And when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of a woman in a dark dress, trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. Morning came with rain beating against the windows. The perfect weather for searching an old house for secrets, I thought grimly as I dressed. At breakfast, I asked Mrs. Bell about Margaret Thompson. You mentioned she lived here her whole life. What else can you tell me about her? Mrs. Bell's hands paused in the act of pouring coffee. She was a quiet woman, never married, kept to herself mostly. When did she die? Oh, years ago now, before my time here. Mrs. Bell seemed uncomfortable. Why the interest in Miss Margaret? I decided to be direct. I'm looking for her diary. Did she keep one? The coffee cup clattered against the saucer as Mrs. Bell set it down too quickly. I wouldn't know about that, and even if she did, such personal items would have been disposed of long ago. She was lying. I could see it in the way she avoided my eyes. Mrs. Bell, please. I need to understand my family, she sighed. Miss Thompson, some things are better left in the past. Your father wanted you to have Thornhill and the family fortune. Isn't that enough? It wasn't enough. Not after what my father's letter had said. Not with the strange things happening in this house. After breakfast, I began my search. If Margaret had lived in the house her whole life, she must have had a bedroom. I started with the unused rooms on the third floor. Dust sheets covered furniture that hadn't been used in decades. Each room I entered felt cold, untouched. None of them gave me any clue about Margaret. By midday, I had searched most of the third floor with no success. I went back to my room to rest, frustrated and tired. As I was washing my hands in the small bathroom attached to my bedroom, I noticed something odd. The wall next to the sink had a different texture than the others. I knocked on it lightly. It sounded hollow. Excitement growing, I examined the wall more closely. A small gap near the floor caught my eye. Not a crack, but a deliberate space. I pressed on the wall, and to my amazement, a section swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. A secret room. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and stepped inside. The passage was short, opening into a small room with a window that had been boarded up from the outside. In the dim light, I could make out a bed, a desk, and a bookshelf. Someone had lived here, hidden away from the rest of the house. On the desk lay a book, its leather cover cracked with age. I opened it carefully. The first page read, "The Private Diary of Margaret Thompson, begun May 15, 1950. I had found it. Taking the diary, I hurried back through the passage to my room, closing the hidden door behind me. I sat on my bed and began to read. Margaret's handwriting was small and neat. Her words clear even after all these years. She had started the diary as a young woman, recording daily life at Thornhill. Her brother Richard, my grandfather, was already successful in the mining business. Margaret lived with him and his wife, helping to raise their son, James, my father. The early entries were ordinary enough: family events, weather, small concerns about household matters. But as I read on, the tone changed. June 10, 1952, Richard brought another man to the house today. They locked themselves in the study for hours. When they came out, Richard looked pleased but troubled. The man carried a small wooden box. I asked Richard about it later, but he told me not to concern myself with men's business, as if I am a child and not a woman of 25. June 18, 1952. Something strange is happening at the mine. 3 workers died yesterday. Richard says it was an accident, but I overheard him telling Catherine, his wife, that it was worth the price. What price is worth 3 lives? July 3, 1952. The dreams have started again. The same one each night. I am in the garden and the ground opens beneath me. Hands pull me down into darkness. I wake screaming, but no one comes. The entries continued, growing darker over the months. Margaret wrote about changes in her brother, how his business grew incredibly successful even as he became more secretive, more prone to angry outbursts. She described strange visitors coming at night and rituals performed in the garden under the new moon. Then came an entry that made my blood run cold. October 31st, 1952. I know the truth now. I followed Richard and his men to the old part of the mine last night. What I saw there, I can hardly bring myself to write. They have made a deal with something that should not exist in God's world. Richard has sold his soul and the souls of his descendants for gold and power. 3 generations, the creature said. 3 generations of wealth, and then payment would be due. When they found me watching, Richard was furious. He says I must never speak of this to anyone, that I will stay at Thornhill, where he can watch me, make sure I keep the secret. I am a prisoner now in my own home. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. If what Margaret wrote was true, my grandfather had made some kind of supernatural deal for the family's wealth, a deal that would last 3 generations. My grandfather was the 1st generation, my father was the 2nd, and I was the 3rd. The final payment. I read on, learning how Margaret had been moved to the hidden room when guests came to the house, how she had been all but erased from the family's public life. She wrote about watching my father grow up, how she tried to warn him as he got older, but no one would believe her mad stories. The diary ended abruptly in 1975, the last entry scrawled in a shaking hand. They are coming for me tonight. I can hear them outside my door. Richard is gone, but his partners in this evil will not let the secret out. James promised to keep my diary safe, to one day use it to break the curse. I pray he finds the strength I never had. I closed the diary, my mind racing. If this was true, if any of it was true, then the curse my father mentioned was real. And as the 3rd generation, I was in danger. But from what? Some supernatural force? Or from very human people who wanted to protect the secret of how the Thompson fortune was really made? A knock at my bedroom door made me jump. I quickly hid the diary under my pillow before opening it. Harold Winters stood there, his face grave. "Miss Thompson, I need to speak with you. It's about your father's letter." My heart skipped a beat. "What letter?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "The one you found in his safe last night. I need to see it." How did he know? I had been alone, and I had put everything back, unless someone had been watching me. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Winters. I kept my face neutral, though fear was building inside me. Is there anything else? He studied me for a long moment. Your father was not well in his final years, Miss Thompson. He had delusions, believed in conspiracies. Anything he may have written to you should be taken with that understanding. Thank you for your concern. I'll keep that in mind. When he left, I locked the door again. My father's letter hadn't mentioned Winters at all. Who could I trust here? Mrs. Bell? Davis the driver? Or was I alone against whatever threat lurked in Thornhill? I needed to learn more. About the mine, about my grandfather's business, about Elizabeth's death. If I was going to break this curse, if I was going to survive the year at Thornhill, I needed to understand what I was fighting against. As evening fell, I made my way back to the library, the diary hidden in my jacket pocket. The house was quiet, the rain still falling outside, drumming against the windows. In the library, I searched the shelves for books about local history, about mining, about the Thompson family business. I found a few promising volumes and settled into a chair to read. Hours passed as I pieced together the public story of my family. My grandfather had indeed become wealthy through gold mining, starting with a small operation that grew mysteriously successful almost overnight. Where other mines failed, his thrived. Where others hit dead rock, he found rich veins of gold. Just as Margaret had written. As I was replacing a book on the shelf, I heard it again, footsteps in the hallway, stopping outside the library door. But when I looked up, no one was there. Then the door swung shut by itself. I ran to it, trying the handle. It was locked. Hello? I called out. Who's there? Let me out. No answer came, but the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the air. A sound behind me made me turn. The woman in the dark dress stood by the fireplace, the same woman I had seen in the garden, whose face I had never clearly seen. Until now. She looked like the photographs of Margaret Thompson, but her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow with sadness or fear. Margaret? I whispered. She nodded slowly. Are you a ghost? Another nod. I should have been terrified, but somehow I wasn't. If Margaret's diary was true, then she had tried to warn my father. Maybe now she was trying to warn me. What do you want to tell me? I asked, stepping closer. She raised her hand, pointing at the wall behind me. I turned to look. She was pointing at a specific book on the shelf. I took it down, a large volume about South African mining history. When I opened it, a loose page fell out. A newspaper clipping from 1953, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Mine Disaster Claims 47 Lives." The article described a collapse in one of my grandfather's mines. The bodies were never recovered, the mine sealed off permanently. When I looked up from the clipping, Margaret was standing right in front of me. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear any words. I don't understand, I said desperately. What are you trying to tell me? She pointed at the clipping, then at the floor beneath us. Down. She was pointing down. The mine? Is something still in the mine? She nodded, her face urgent. Then she vanished, simply fading away like mist. The door clicked, unlocking itself. I stood in the silent library, the clipping in my hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Margaret's ghost had shown me this article for a reason. Something about this mine disaster was connected to the curse, to the deal my grandfather had made. And whatever it was still down there, in the sealed mine. I needed to find that mine. The next morning, I went to find Davis. If anyone knew the local area well, it would be the driver who had worked for the family for years. I found him in the garage, polishing the car. When I asked him about the old Thompson mines, his hands stilled. Why would you want to know about those, miss? They've been closed for decades. I'm curious about my family history, I said, trying to sound casual. Especially the one that had the big collapse in 1953. Do you know where it is? Davis looked uncomfortable. That would be the Blackwater mine. Bad business, that was. It's about 20 kilometers from here, but there's nothing to see. It was sealed off after the accident. Could you take me there? He hesitated. Mr. Winters wouldn't like it. Mr. Winters doesn't need to know. I met his eyes. Please, Davis, it's important. Something in my expression must have convinced him. He nodded slowly. We can go this afternoon. I'll tell Mrs. Bell we're going to the shops in town. The drive to Blackwater Mine was tense. Davis kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, clearly worried about disobeying Winters. I stared out the window, watching as the city gave way to drier, rocky landscape. There, Davis said finally, pointing ahead. That's what's left of the Blackwater Mine. It wasn't much to look at, just a fenced area with warning signs and an old, rusted gate. The entrance to the mine was visible as a dark opening in the hillside, partially collapsed and blocked with concrete barriers. "Wait here," I told Davis as I got out of the car. "Miss Thompson, you can't go in there. It's dangerous." "I'm just going to look," I assured him. "I won't go inside." I walked to the fence, examining the warning signs. They were old, the paint faded by decades of sun. The padlock on the gate was new, though. Someone was still maintaining the security here, keeping people out. Beyond the fence, I could see the mine entrance, sealed as Davis had said. But something else caught my eye, a small building off to the side, what might have been an office or supply shed. I wanted to get closer, to see inside that building. But the fence was too high to climb, and Davis was watching anxiously from the car. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the ground near my feet. A small stone, unusually heavy for its size. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It had a strange quality, darker than the surrounding rocks, with a faint pattern like veins running through it. I put it in my pocket and went back to the car. "Did you see what you needed to see, miss?" Davis asked as I got in. "Not really," I admitted, "but it's a start." On the drive back, Davis was quiet for a while. Then, as if coming to a decision, he spoke. "My father worked that mine, Miss Thompson." I looked up in surprise. "He did?" "Yes, he wasn't working the day of the collapse, thank God. But he knew something was wrong with that place. Said the men heard things in the deep tunnels, voices when no one was there, tools moving on their own." My skin prickled. "Did he tell my grandfather?" "He tried. They all did. But your grandfather said they were being superstitious, that the noises were just the mountains settling." Davis's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "After the collapse, my father never went near a mine again." "Do you think—" I hesitated, not sure how to ask. "Do you think something unnatural happened there?" Davis met my eyes in the mirror. "I think your family got their fortune at a price, Miss Thompson, and I think some debts don't stay paid." Back at Thornhill, I hid the strange stone in my room and went to find Mrs. Bell. I needed to know more about Elizabeth's death, my father's second wife, whose face had been scratched out in the photograph. I found her in the kitchen, preparing dinner. "Mrs. Bell," I said, sitting at the small table where the staff ate their meals, "how did Elizabeth die, my father's wife?" Mrs. Bell's hands stilled. "It was an accident, dear. She fell down the main stairs, broke her neck." "Was anyone with her when it happened?" "No, she was alone. Your father found her when he came home." Mrs. Bell continued chopping vegetables, not looking at me. "It was very sad. She was a lovely woman. Do you think it was really an accident?" Now she did look up, her eyes sharp. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just trying to understand what happened in this house." Mrs. Bell put down her knife. "Miss Thompson, I've worked for your family a long time. I've seen things I can't explain, heard things in the night that shouldn't be possible. But I keep my head down and do my job because that's all any of us can do. But if someone is in danger, everyone in this house is in danger." She said it softly, almost to herself. Then, louder, "Your father tried to warn you, didn't he, in his letter?" I stared at her. "How do you know about that?" "Because he told me he was writing it. He knew his time was running out." "Mrs. Bell, please. I need to understand what's happening here." She sighed. "I don't know everything, but I know your grandfather made a deal he shouldn't have made. I know people who get too close to the truth tend to have accidents, like Elizabeth when she started asking questions about the old mine." A chill ran through me. "You think she was murdered?" "I think once you're part of the Thompson family, there's no easy way out." She picked up her knife again. "Be careful, Miss Thompson. Watch your step on the stairs." That night I couldn't sleep. Everything I had learned swirled in my mind. Margaret's diary, the newspaper clipping, Davis's story about the mine, Mrs. Bell's warning. 3 generations of wealth, and then payment would be due. I took out the stone I had found at the mine, examining it in the lamplight. The veins running through it seemed to shift and move as I turned it, like they were alive. On an impulse, I took out my phone and searched for information about cursed mines, supernatural mining disasters, deals with spirits for mineral wealth. Most of what I found was clearly fiction, old legends and stories, but some accounts from different cultures around the world seemed too similar to be coincidence. Stories of miners making offerings to earth spirits, of strange discoveries in deep tunnels, of wealth that came at a terrible price. One article particularly caught my attention, about a small tribe in West Africa who believed some gold was cursed, carrying the spirits of those who died mining it. They had a specific ritual for cleansing such gold, returning it to the earth along with offerings to appease the spirits. Returning it to the earth. Was that the answer? Did I need to somehow return the Thompson wealth to its source? A noise outside my door made me freeze. Footsteps, padding softly down the hallway. Then a whisper, words I couldn't make out, but the voice wasn't one I recognized. I went to the door, pressing my ear against it. The whispering continued, joined by another voice. They were right outside, talking too quietly for me to understand the words. Then silence. I waited a full minute before carefully opening the door, looking both ways down the dark hallway. No one was there. But on the floor in front of my door lay a small piece of paper, folded in half. I picked it up and took it back into my room, locking the door behind me. Written in a shaky hand were the words, "Leave Thornhill now, before it's too late." The warning note changed everything. Someone in the house wanted me gone, someone other than the ghost of Margaret. But was it to save me or to prevent me from discovering the truth? In the morning, I went to find Harold Winters. It was time for direct questions. I found him in the study, working on papers. He looked up when I entered, his face neutral. "Mr. Winters, I need to know about the Blackwater mine disaster, the one my grandfather owned." His expression didn't change. "It was before my time with the family, Miss Thompson. A tragic accident, nothing more." Was it an accident, or was it something else? Now a flicker of concern crossed his face. "What exactly are you implying?" "I found Margaret's diary," I said flatly. "I know about the deal my grandfather made." Winter's face paled. "Miss Thompson, your great-aunt Margaret was not well. Her writings are the fantasies of a disturbed mind." "Then why was she hidden away in a secret room? Why is her grave separated from the rest of the family?" He stood up. "I think you've been letting your imagination run wild. Old houses often inspire such thoughts. Perhaps you should get some fresh air." "I also found this at the mine." I took the strange stone from my pocket, placing it on the desk between us. Winters stared at it, making no move to touch it. "Where did you get that?" "So you know what it is?" "It's nothing, just a rock." But his voice lacked conviction. "I think it's connected to whatever is in that mine. Whatever my grandfather made a deal with." I leaned forward. "I think my father knew it too. That's why he left me that letter." Winter's eyes snapped to mine. "What exactly did that letter say?" "Enough for me to know I'm in danger here, that the third generation pays the price." He was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, suddenly looking much older. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Miss Thompson. None of us do, not fully. Your grandfather found something in that mine, something old and powerful. It offered him wealth beyond imagining in exchange for a price to be paid later." "Human lives," I said quietly. "The miners who died in the collapse." "That was just the beginning," Winters said. "The real price was his family's future. 3 generations of prosperity, then the bloodline ends." "Ends how? However it must. Accident, illness, suicide. The specifics don't matter, but the third generation, you, cannot continue the Thompson line." I felt cold all over. "So I'm supposed to just accept that? Let some curse kill me because of a deal my grandfather made?" "Your father tried to break it," Winters said. "After Elizabeth died, he spent years researching, traveling to speak with experts in the occult. He found nothing. Until Margaret's diary." Winters nodded slowly. "Yes, he found it last year, hidden where she left it. That's when he contacted you. He believed the answer was there, in her writings." "And what do you believe, Mr. Winters?" He looked tired. "I believe some bargains can't be undone, but your father wanted you to have the chance to try. That's why the condition in the will, 1 year at Thornhill, time to find a solution if one exists." "And if I leave?" The curse follows the bloodline, not the house. He picked up a pen, turning it in his fingers nervously. But at least here you have the resources to fight it. The diary, the library, people who know the truth. People like you? Are you trying to help me or make sure the curse completes itself? I am the Thompson family attorney, Miss Thompson. I serve the family's interests. He met my eyes. But I also served your father, who wanted more for you than this legacy of doom. I wasn't sure I believed him, but he had confirmed what I already suspected. The curse was real, and I was its target. The stone, I said, picking it up again. What is it? Winters hesitated. Your grandfather called it a heartstone. He said it came from the deepest part of the mine, where no man had dug before. There were more once. Most were lost in the collapse. Most, but not all. No, your grandfather kept one. After he died, your father took possession of it. He believed it was the key to the curse, that returning it to the mine might break the bond. Did he try? He went to the mine the night before he died. When he returned, he was changed. He wouldn't speak of what happened there. The next day, he had his heart attack. I closed my hand around the stone. It felt warm now, almost pulsing like a tiny heart. I need to go to the mine, I said. Tonight. That would be extremely dangerous. More dangerous than waiting for the curse to kill me? Winters had no answer for that. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I found a small backpack and filled it with things I might need: a flashlight, water, Margaret's diary, my father's letter. I changed into sturdy clothes and boots. As evening approached, I went to find Davis. I needed his help to get to the mine, but Davis wasn't in the garage or his small room off the kitchen. Mrs. Bell hadn't seen him all afternoon. He got a call and went out, she said, didn't say where. This was a problem. Without Davis, I had no way to reach the mine. I could try to find it myself, but I didn't know the area well enough. As I stood in the hallway, trying to decide what to do, I felt a cold draft. Turning, I saw Margaret's ghost at the end of the hall, beckoning to me. I followed her through the house, down to the cellar I hadn't yet explored. At the back, behind old furniture and crates, was a door I hadn't noticed before. Margaret pointed at it, then vanished. The door was locked, but the old-fashioned keyhole was large. On a hunch, I tried the key Winters had given me for my father's safe. It didn't fit. Looking around the cellar, I spotted a set of keys hanging on a nail near the stairs. I tried each one in the lock. The third key worked. The door opened to reveal a tunnel, rough-hewn from the rock, leading downward. A mine tunnel, right under Thornhill. I took out my flashlight and stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, the walls rough against my fingers as I felt my way forward. The tunnel sloped downward, turning and twisting. In some places, old wooden supports held up the ceiling. In others, the tunnel had been reinforced with more modern materials. I walked for what seemed like hours, though my watch told me it was less than one. The tunnel continued downward, sometimes branching. At each fork, I found a small mark scratched into the wall, a triangle. Someone had marked the way. My father or someone else? Finally, the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far wall or ceiling. I moved forward cautiously, the beam catching on something ahead, a pile of rocks in the center of the chamber. No, not rocks. A structure built of the strange dark stones like the one in my pocket. They were arranged in a circle perhaps 3 meters across, with a flat stone in the center like an altar. As my light played across the structure, I saw marks on the central stone, dark stains that might have been old blood. This was where it had happened, where my grandfather had made his deal. I took out the heartstone from my pocket. It was definitely warm now, and the veins within it seemed to glow faintly with their own light. What was I supposed to do? Place it on the altar? Speak words from Margaret's diary? I hadn't found any specific ritual described in her writings. You won't break it that way. The voice from behind me made me spin around, heart pounding. Harold Winters stood at the entrance to the chamber, a lantern in his hand. How did you find me? I asked. I've known about this tunnel for years. Your father showed it to me. He stepped forward. I followed you from the house. Why? To make sure you don't do anything foolish. He nodded at the stone in my hand. That won't save you. Nothing will. Something in his voice had changed. The professional calm was gone, replaced by something harder, colder. You don't want me to break the curse, I realized. You're not here to help me. The bargain must be honored. 3 generations, then payment. Those were the terms. You knew. All this time, you knew. Winters laughed, a sound without humor. My family has served yours for 3 generations, Miss Thompson. We have our own arrangement with the entity your grandfather found. What arrangement? We ensure the bargain is fulfilled. In return, we share in the prosperity. He took another step toward me. Your father almost ruined everything with his conscience, his need to protect you. But in the end, he couldn't escape his fate. You killed him. The words came out as a whisper. The curse killed him. I simply helped it along. Winters reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Just as I'll help it along with you, if necessary. But there's an easier way. Give me the stone, leave Thornhill, renounce your inheritance. You can live out your days somewhere far away. Until the curse finds me anyway. Yes, but you might have years, decades even, a natural lifespan, ended only slightly prematurely. I clutched the heartstone tighter. And if I refuse, then you die here tonight, and we tell the authorities you ran away. Either way, the Thompson line ends with you. I looked around desperately for a way out. There was only one entrance to the chamber, and Winters stood in front of it. The stone circle behind me offered no escape, unless... The stones, I said. They're connected to the entity, aren't they? That's why you want this one. They are a tether between worlds. The more that remain here, the stronger the bond. Which meant the fewer that remained, the weaker the bond might become. I took a step backward, toward the stone circle. Stay back, or I'll destroy it. Winters laughed again. You can't destroy it. Many have tried. Maybe not, but I can take it where you can't follow. I lunged backward, jumping into the center of the stone circle. As soon as my feet touched the altar stone, the air around me seemed to thicken. The veins in the heartstone glowed brighter, pulsing like a living thing. Winters shouted something, raising his gun, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. The chamber around me was fading, the walls becoming transparent. Beyond them, I could see. Elsewhere. A place of shadows and strange lights. The heartstone was burning hot in my hand now, its glow illuminating my face. I knew, somehow, that I stood at a threshold. One step more, and I would pass from the world I knew into whatever realm the entity called home. Was that what my father had done? Had he faced this same choice? Winters fired the gun. I felt heat pass by my face as the bullet missed me by inches. He fired again, but the bullet seemed to slow in midair, stopped by whatever force surrounded the stone circle. I had only seconds to decide. Step forward into the unknown, or backward into a bullet. But there was a third option. Margaret's diary had spoken of her brother's bargain with a creature from beyond. 3 generations of wealth in exchange for... What? The diary wasn't specific. But if the deal was with an entity that valued human souls, perhaps there was another bargain to be made. My life for the breaking of the curse. I know you can hear me, I said aloud, addressing the emptiness beyond the chamber walls. I am Olivia Thompson, the 3rd generation. I offer myself freely if you will release my family from this curse. The air thickened further, pressure building in my ears. Then a voice, not heard with my ears but felt in my bones, responded. Why should I accept this bargain? Your family pledged 3 generations. You are the final payment. Because I'm offering more than just my death. I'm offering my willing surrender. Isn't that worth more than a death taken by force? Silence stretched. Then, what would you ask in return? End the curse. Let the Thompson line continue after me, free of your influence, and let me go once the bargain is struck. The pressure increased, becoming almost painful. You ask much, 3rd daughter. I offer much. A willing soul has power that a taken one does not. More silence. I was aware of Winters shouting, of him trying to enter the stone circle but being pushed back by an invisible force. He hadn't expected this, me confronting the entity directly. I will accept this bargain, with one condition. You must destroy the stones, all of them. They have bound me here too long. I don't know how to destroy them. You have the means already. I thought hard. What did I have that could destroy these stones? Nothing in my backpack seemed powerful enough. Then I remembered what the article had said about returning cursed gold to the earth with the proper rituals. Not destroying, but returning. The stones belong in the deep earth, don't they? Where they came from. A feeling like approval washed over me. Yes, Return them to the deep. Break the circle. Free me from this half-world, and I will free your line from its doom. I looked at the stone circle around me. If I moved the stones, broke the pattern, I accept your terms. The pressure released suddenly. I could move again, breathe normally. The walls of the chamber were solid once more. Winters stood frozen, guns still raised, a look of shock on his face. "What did you do?" he whispered. "I made a new bargain." I bent down and picked up one of the stones from the circle, breaking the pattern. Nothing terrible happened. "Stop!" Winters lunged forward, but invisible hands seemed to hold him back. "You don't know what you're doing. I'm ending this." I picked up another stone and another, moving them from their carefully placed positions. The structure was collapsing, the power it had contained dissipating. Winters screamed, a sound of pure fury. He fired the gun again, and this time there was no force to stop the bullet. Pain bloomed in my shoulder, hot and sharp. I staggered, but didn't fall. Blood soaked through my shirt, but I kept working, moving the stones, destroying the circle. When I moved the last stone, the central altar split with a crack like thunder. A deep fissure opened in the ground beneath it, spreading outward. "What's happening?" Winter's voice was high with fear. "The bargain is fulfilled. The stones are returning to the deep." I backed away from the widening crack. "We need to get out of here." But Winters was frozen in place, staring at something I couldn't see, his face contorted in terror. "They're coming," he whispered, "the ones from below." The ground shook, the tremors growing stronger. Dust and small rocks fell from the ceiling. The tunnel was going to collapse. "Run!" I shouted at Winters, already turning toward the exit. He didn't move, couldn't move, it seemed, held in place by whatever he was seeing. I hesitated for only a moment. Then I ran, clutching my bleeding shoulder, as the chamber began to collapse behind me. I heard Winters scream once more, then silence. The journey back through the tunnel was a nightmare of falling rocks and choking dust. My shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, blood making my hands slippery on the flashlight. Finally, I reached the cellar door, bursting through it just as the tunnel behind me collapsed completely. The force of it knocked me to the ground. I lay there, gasping for breath, as the house above shook with the tremors. Glass shattered somewhere. A crack appeared in the cellar wall, spreading upward. Thornhill was falling. With the last of my strength, I climbed the stairs to the main floor. Mrs. Bell was there, her face pale with fear. "Miss Thompson, what's happening?" "The house is collapsing. We need to get out." I looked around. "Where's Davis?" "Outside, I think." "What have you done?" "Broken the curse. But we need to leave, now." She didn't argue. We ran for the front door as more cracks appeared in the walls, plaster dust filling the air. Outside, the night was clear and cool, stars bright overhead. We made it to the garden before looking back. Thornhill was shaking, parts of the roof already caving in. As we watched, the east wing collapsed entirely. Davis appeared from around the side of the house, running toward us. "What's happening? Where's Mr. Winters?" "He's gone," I said simply, "and Thornhill is going with him." We stood in silence as the mansion continued to fold in on itself, becoming a ruin before our eyes. I thought I saw figures moving in the dust and debris, Margaret, perhaps, and others I didn't recognize. Free now, their ties to the house broken at last. "The curse," Mrs. Bell asked softly, "is broken." I winced as pain shot through my shoulder. "But at a cost." Davis saw the blood on my shirt. "You're hurt. We need to get you to a hospital." As he helped me to his car, I looked back one last time at what remained of Thornhill. The mansion was almost gone now, returning to the earth like the stones from the mine. 3 generations of wealth, built on a dark bargain, now ended. In the hospital later, as doctors worked to remove the bullet from my shoulder, I thought about what would come next. The Thompson fortune was still mine, what was left of it. Enough to help others, to do good in the world. And enough to ensure that any children I might have one day would never have to make the choices my grandfather made out of greed, or that my father made out of fear. They would be free of the curse that had haunted the Thompson family for 3 generations, free to make their own path, their own mistakes, their own triumphs. As the darkness of anesthesia claimed me, I thought I heard Margaret's voice, faint but clear. "Thank you." The end.